Well, good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out. I'm William Anthony Hay, the Associate Director for Public Programs at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State University. So thank you again for coming out to another of our events in the Civic Discourse Project. Our theme this year with the Civic Discourse Project is Sustaining American Political Order in History and Practice. And today we have a timely discussion of moderation as a complex and neglected political virtue. Indeed, Arizonans will recognize Barry Goldwater's famous line about extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Is that true, or an immoderate excess of enthusiasm, as people said back in the 1960s at the time? Now, this year is the school's 8th year organizing the Civic Discourse Project for Arizona State University and for the wider Phoenix community. We're glad to continue our collaboration with Arizona PBS for another season of recording the CDP. They archive all of our events on their website and broadcast episodes in the spring of each year. You can also explore the school's video archives of speaker events and webinars on SCETL's YouTube channel and on our ASU website, including all the lecture and dialogue events in the Civic Discourse Project from 2017 onward. We've worked for 8 years to convene a high-level conversation with single speaker, with dialogue events, and an annual conference that together encompass a range of views. And this public program, our public project, is an extension of SCETL's academic program, our courses, curriculum and degrees, and student experiences that strive to reconnect liberal arts and American civic education. So now on to our speaker. Aurelian Craiutu is a professor at Indiana University, specializing in political thought and the history of ideas. Educated in France and his native Romania, he earned a doctorate at Princeton University with a prize-winning dissertation. Professor Craiutu has the distinct honor this December of giving an invited lecture to the Académie Française on the statesman François Guizot, commemorating Guizot's 150th anniversary of Guizot's death. Craiutu's work is focused on the tensions between liberalism and its critics from the French Revolution into the early 19th century. And these themes, though historic, are not surprisingly relevant to our current moment. His books include A Virtue for Courageous Minds, Moderation in French Political Thought, 1748, 1830, and Why Not Moderation? Letters to Young Radicals. Copies of that latter book will be available for purchase and signing following today's lecture. So I'm delighted to welcome Aurelian Craiutu, asking, who is afraid of moderation? Aurelian. Thank you.
Thanks for coming tonight. I would like to point out from the very beginning that it may seem pointless or utopian to ask this question, who is afraid of moderation? We know who, so this is an exercise in utopian thinking. The temperature of the political game today is very high. I don't need to tell you there will be a rally in town 2 days from now. The stakes seems higher than ever. The victory of one side is seen by the other as a grave existential threat to the country. For many, it's now or never. The most zealous believe that we are on an infamous Flight 93 pathway, that we need to do something in order to prevent the crash. So let's start with this question, which is there. Who needs moderation today? This is the million-dollar question. And I think that the important question to ask is, do we really need moderation, and what do we mean by that? Although I have written a lot about moderation, I must give you an advance warning, a trigger warning, as some might say. My answer may not seem moderate at all to you, because in the end I will try to convince you that moderation can offer what we really need today. We need a new MAGA movement. But wait a minute, it's Make America Governable again. So this is the kind of moderation that I would like to suggest we need. There is a lot that can be said about the image problem that moderation has in our world. When asking this question, who needs moderation today, it's mostly about what do we mean by that and what kind of moderation. And Professor Hay has reminded us of a sentence uttered 6 decades ago by one of Arizona's legends, Senator Barry Goldwater. Extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. I'm sure that some of you think that we don't need moderation today any more than in 1964, and you may be right after all. Today we live in bubbles and echo chambers, and our cable news world has little use of this virtue and appetite for this virtue. Under these circumstances, it seems that to practice moderation would be utopian at best and a self-defeating course at worst. Above all, it is a difficult and dangerous virtue, as the image of this guy, the tightrope walker, suggests. This is how I see moderates today. So the question that I would like to ask is a little bit different now. Why have moderates become a sort of endangered species in dire of protection? So it's not easy to answer this question. It's no secret that moderation has an image problem in our world of fake news, alternative facts, echo chambers, hyper-polarization, and sectarianism. We've seen our politicians and even our colleagues in academia saying my way or the highway. We live in a no-compromise era. We live in an era of cancel culture, public insults, and primaries in which moderates have been constantly challenged by those who stressed purity and litmus tests. There is a declining faith in the democratic institutions as well, and moderates have been accused of being weak, timid, and indecisive. And what's surprising is that the skepticism of moderation comes from all kinds of political angles and sides. I would like to give you 2 examples here. One is from John Stuart Mill, who said this on liberty: the general average of mankind are not only moderate in intellect, but also moderate in inclinations. They have no taste or wishes strong enough to incline them to do anything unusual. This is not an endorsement of moderation from a liberal who wrote on liberty. But then you have Rush Limbaugh, the famous conservative radio host, who said this: by definition, moderates can't be brave. They don't have opinions. Brave moderates, great moderates in American history, show me that book. And there is also this idea, which you can, I think, get from John Stuart Mill's quote, that moderates and moderation can never be truly democratic enough, that they condone various forms of injustice and status quo. And this is something that you can get in Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from Birmingham jail. This is the view of moderation as being a covert way of condoning injustice in society. And this is the view that you have, for example, today in the words of someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who has promoted this view of America as precisely a moderate country and therefore a locus for injustice. So these are serious challenges for anyone who studies moderation. And I would like to start from the very beginning by saying that all of these things need to be taken seriously into consideration by anyone who seeks to, let's say, talk about moderation, if not to praise it. The problem that I have had studying moderation is that it's a difficult virtue to study. It's difficult to be enthusiastic about moderation to begin with, but it's also quite difficult to study. It's a multifaceted and it's a complex virtue to begin with, and it is what I would like to call a lost archipelago. We have a lot of thinkers in the canon of political thought, from Aristotle through Cicero to Montesquieu, the authors of the Federalist Papers, Tocqueville and Burke, but we don't know what connects them. So that's why I'm using the metaphor of archipelago, because it gives us a sense of what connects them. But the nature and the complexity of moderation, I think, cannot be captured by using a purely philosophical or analytical approach. You can't have a theory of moderation, as you could have a theory of justice written by John Rawls. It requires instead concrete historical examples and extensive historical forays. So by definition, any study of moderation requires a foray into history. And even more interestingly, from my perspective as a historian of political thought, is that the richness of moderation can be grasped only if it's placed within a larger semantic field, which includes related concepts such as temperance, prudence, juste milieu, mixed or moderate government, and antonyms, opposites, such as fanaticism, extremism, radicalism, or zealotry. So it's very important to look at moderation as part of this semantic field. So really, anyone who studies moderation must take into account the complexity of this historical and semantic field. And I think that this is extremely important for anyone who criticizes moderation, because there is no such thing as moderation. There are phases of moderation. And that's what I've been trying to do in my own work. And I started with studying moderation in the classical tradition. I put there on the slide a number of quotes from distinguished names, Aristotle, Polybius, Tacitus, Cicero, and also the Doctrine of the Mean. I'm not going to read them, but I want to point out that all of these authors, from Aristotle to Polybius and Tacitus, agreed on the fact that moderation is probably the most difficult lesson of wisdom, to use Tacitus' words, or to use Cicero's words, it is essential to the preservation of the harmony between classes in the state. I resist with difficulty the temptation of quoting from Aristotle, who said that the master of any arts avoids excess and defect, but seeks intermediate and chooses this. So what's also, I think, important to highlight is that what we have in the classical tradition has been continued in the modern thought tradition. So I've proposed here a few authors that have written not necessarily about moderation, but in whose works the concept of moderation appears prominently. Montaigne's Essays, for example, a book that belongs into the canon of any educated person, can be seen as an apology of moderation. He said somewhere, I think it's in the essay on experience towards the end of the book, our most glorious achievement is to live our life fittingly, which in his view is with moderation. La Bruyere, in The Characters, defined moderation as a divine virtue, and he noted everything that partakes of the extremes is imperfect and shares in the shortcomings of human beings. Pascal himself, in his famous book Pensées, which he never published as such, wrote that nature has placed us in the middle, and the greatness of human condition consists precisely in knowing how to remain there. My favorite of all of these authors is the one on the bottom of the screen. Some of you may have not heard of him. Is Baltasar Gracián, a Jesuit thinker from the 17th century Spain. In a book on prudence, he defined moderation as related to prudence because it gives us the inner knowledge of the moral truth necessary to act and live well. But the most inspiring definitions of moderation, in my view, can be found in the writings of two 17th century thinkers. And the first one is Joseph Hall, who is the author of a book called Christian Moderation in 1640, in which he defined moderation as the silken string that runs through the pearl chain of all virtues. The silken string that runs through the pearl chain of all virtues. 4 decades later, in the 1680s, the Marquis of Halifax referred to moderation as an art of balance, and he referred to the concept of trimming. It's a nautical metaphor that refers to the act of keeping the balance of the ship on an even keel. So when the ship of the state, in this case, leans to the left, you lean to the right in order to prevent it from capsizing, and vice versa. When it leans to the right, it leans to the left in order to maintain it on an even keel. This is taken from a text called The Character of a Trimmer, which will be reissued by Oxford University Press next year. These are important definitions that I think predated the political meaning of moderation that became prominent in the 1700s, so in the 18th century. It is basically in the 18th century that we have a clear understanding of moderation as essential to building an institutional structure that allows people to live freely. And this is a close relationship that thinkers in the 18th century drew between political liberty, moderation, security, and the laws. And of course, the author that I'm most interested in here is Montesquieu, because Montesquieu referred in his book, The Spirit of the Laws, to moderation as the supreme virtue of the legislator. Interestingly, he writes a book that has, I think, 507 chapters and 31 books, The Spirit of the Laws, and it's only in the book 29, chapter 1, that he writes this: I've written this work only to prove it. The spirit of moderation should be that of the legislator. It's interesting that Montesquieu, in 1748, when the book appeared, wrote about moderate government. And it is interesting also how he defines moderate government. And he wrote in chapter 14 of book 5, one must combine powers, regulate them, temper them, make them act. One must give one power a ballast, so to speak, to put it in a position to resist another. As such, moderate government is a work of art, a masterpiece of legislation that chance rarely produces and prudence is rarely allowed to produce. These are wonderful words that Montesquieu wrote in The Spirit of the Laws, and I think that they connect to a concept that is very familiar to anyone who studies American political thought, balance of powers. And I would like to read Montesquieu's conclusion here about balance of powers, because I think is representative of the complexity of moderation as institutional aspect are coming to the fore. Here, therefore, he wrote, is the fundamental constitution of the government of which we are speaking. As its legislative body is composed of two parts, the one will be chained to the other by their reciprocal faculty of vetoing. The two will be bound by the executive power, which will itself be bound by the legislative power. As they are constrained to move by the necessary motion of things, they will be forced to move in concert. This is from chapter 6 of famous book 11. What's worth noting here is precisely the connection between moderation, balance of powers, and political pluralism, customs, mores that act as tempering devices and prerequisites of what we take to be a free society. What's essential here is that moderate government is based on the interdependence of mutually limiting powers and authorities. So the connection between moderation and institutional complexity comes to the fore in this quote from Montesquieu. Of course, you can find, contrary to what Rush Limbaugh tried to suggest as moderation in American tradition, there's a lot that can be said here. The Federalist Papers are, I think, a book or a series of essays on moderation, which is equated here with open-minded reasonableness, a disposition to avoid extremes of action and expression. The word moderation, I counted, appears over 11 times in the course of the essays, perhaps more in the Federalist Papers. George Washington's farewell address is also, in my understanding, a text that puts moderation at the heart of the American political tradition. What Washington saw in moderation in 1796 when he wrote the farewell address, or Hamilton wrote it, we don't know yet, is moderation can be seen as a source of strength, and a judicious approach is essential for good government. And I think that his warning in 1796 is relevant for us today, because we need to resist intolerant extremes and ideological zealotry. My favorite quote of all this comes from John Adams, who said, "Without moderation, every man in power becomes a ravenous beast of prey." Of course, there's finally in the 18th century the image of moderation as the opposite of fanaticism and political enthusiasm. You see this in the works of Hume, Voltaire, the Encyclopédie. But the idea here is that moderates believe that truth is never on one side only and the error on the other. And the idea is that we we should acknowledge that we have duties towards those who think differently from us, other than trying to convince and convert them. So the connection between moderation and toleration, between moderation and civility, are very important, I think, to keep in mind as we try to unearth this archipelago of moderation. So what this amounts to, you would ask, it's very important, I think, to highlight that when we speak about moderation, we take into account three levels of observation or analysis. Moderation as an ethical virtue is important to highlight, and this appeared in the quotations that I gave from classical political thought. Moderation as a mean between extremes. It's linked to prudence. It's a virtue that helps human beings deliberate well about what is truly good and directs the will towards the target. And it's a moral virtue that prevents passion from blinding prudence. That is the idea that we can get from the classical authors, moderation as an ethical virtue. But equally important, and this is what I've tried to suggest with the quotes from Montesquieu and Federer's papers, is moderation has an institutional or constitutional side to it that is illustrated by the connection with separation or balance of powers, other devices such as bicameralism, veto, federalism, or polycentricity. And those elements are usually neglected. When people talk about moderation, they refer to the ethical component. But the idea that there is such a thing as a moderate government that is an intrinsically complex structure that depends on a judicious arrangement of powers and a combination of interests and groups is not the work of nature. This idea tends to get lost in the conversation. And finally, the third level of analysis which gets lost in the conversation today is moderation as a style or an ethos. This may seem easy to define. You could point to civility, humility, prudence, the opposite of self-righteousness and zealotry, but it's only an illusion. And I would think that it's better to be prudent and define moderation as the spirit which is never too sure that it is right and it is open to learning from others. And I think that this is the best thing we can say about moderation, much in a way similar to what Judge Learned Hand said about the spirit of liberty, that you can never be sure that you are right, you are open to learning from others and correcting your mistakes, if any. So this explains, I think, all of these three levels, the complexity of moderation, but also it explains the many phases of moderation over time. Moderates tend to disguise themselves, either as the Stoic, in Cicero or Seneca's works, the prudent man, and you can find the image of prudence in Aristotle, Machiavelli even, in Guicciardini and Baltasar Gracian. You have the image of moderate as the trimmer, and this is the Marquis of Halifax, but in modern era, you have this in the works of Michael Oakeshott. You have the image of the skeptic, moderate as the skeptic, and you find this in Montaigne, but also in David Hume's work. The moderate appears as a pluralist, defender of pluralism. You can find this in Madison's works and Isaiah Berlin's. You can find the moderate as the individual above the fray. And this is the image that George Washington sought to convey, but also you can find it in the works of Alexis de Tocqueville. The image of moderate as a critic of zealotry and fanaticism. My favorite of all is Desiderius Erasmus, but you can also have it in the works of Burke. The moderate can also appear as the eclectic thinker. In the 19th century, there was an important French philosopher by the name Victor Cousin, who actually wrote about eclecticism. And finally, my hero Raymond Aron as the committed observer. All of these are, as I would like to call them, phases of moderation, because I think that you cannot point to one that is more important than others. So when we try to talk about moderation, we should take into account the possibility of moderates carrying all of these images. So the question that is worth asking now is, what do moderates stand for? Well, there are lots of things that one could say here, and I think that the question that we should ask is, what is the mentality of those who tend to put moderation first? I think that we could say at least a few things, and I would be open to your comments and question in the question and answers time. So moderation presupposes, as I understand it, the courage to swim against the current. In many respects, moderates resemble the tightrope walkers that I tried to suggest earlier, who must always be extremely careful to maintain their balance to avoid falling. Moderates, as I understand them, are trimmers concerned with preserving the balance and the equilibrium of the states. To restore equilibrium in society, moderates tend to adopt some of the soundest attitude and principles of all parties, and they seek to facilitate agreements between them in order to calm passions and heal wounds. And this is why I started from the need to lower the political temperature today, which is too high. Protecting the balance between different social and political forces and interests is essential to, I think, maintaining freedom in society. Far from being weak, timid, and indecisive, the moderates tend to have a kind of a fighting and energetic attitude that thrives on partisanship, radiates openness, and refuses to practice political vendetta. Moderates share a preoccupation with limiting or fighting political evil. They are open to dialogue, and they reject an all-or-nothing approach, a Manichaean view of the world, forces of light versus forces of evil. They tend to endorse an ethics of responsibility as opposed to an ethics of absolute ends. This is just a basic list of things that moderates tend to adopt. And here is a list of some moderate agendas that you may want to know about. I mentioned earlier the emergence of a movement called the juste milieu between revolution and reaction in 19th century France. Those were, let's say, apostles of bourgeoisie in 1830s July monarchy in France. The author that Professor Hay mentioned, François Guizot, was one of those who defended the juste milieu, the middle of the road between revolution and reaction. Closer to our eras here, you have the ordoliberalism doctrine in post-war Germany. Some of you may not know, but Germany had an economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s, and that was made possible by this doctrine, ordoliberalism, that created what we know as social market economy. Some important thinkers, among them Wilhelm Röpke, were part and parcel of this renaissance of Germany. Strange as it may seem, the Prague Spring movement of 1968 that led to the Soviet invasion, consequently, was defined by Milan Kundera, a famous French Czech writer, as a revolt of the moderates. In Poland, communist Poland, the Solidarity movement was such an interesting movement that started with the concept of self-limiting revolution. Self-limiting revolution. It's almost a paradox, a tautology, if you wish. And then the Charter 77 in former Czechoslovakia that included thinkers such as Václav Havel, the former president, was also a movement inspired by promoting what Havel called the power of the powerless. In some respects, the doctrine of the Third Way in the late 90s in the United Kingdom can be seen as a form of moderation. But the most interesting one is the moderate party in Sweden. I don't know whether anyone is familiar with this party, which is called Moderaterna. It's a party that has been in power in Sweden. It was founded in 1904. It's a kind of a conservative liberal party that has actually given Sweden 2 prime ministers. It's now, to my knowledge, the 3rd largest party in Sweden, and it's called the Moderate Party. Again, it has a conservative liberal approach in economics, but it's interesting that they won elections and they have been in power for some time. So all of these are just examples of some moderate agendas that have appeared over time. So I think it's time to look at our world today. And I'm sorry to say that, but I will have some bad news to start with. I like this quote from George Orwell because, in a way, it reflects, I use it in my book as well, it reflects the predicament that we're facing today. We have sunk to a depth, apologies for the typo, at which the restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent man. Restatement of the duty is the first duty of intelligent man. Mencken, the American journalist, who is difficult to characterize, said half of the sorrows of the world are caused by making false assumptions, and one such assumption is that moderation is a weak virtue that lacks a magnetic idea. Not surprisingly, I think moderation rarely figures on the list of proposed remedies for overcoming hyperpolarization today. We've seen plenty of examples in the last 5 years, in the last 20 years, examples of claims promising comprehensive, rapid, large-scale change, omnipresent in our politics, in our social media. You've heard about the Green New Deal, the Drain the Swamp, abolish ICE, defund the police, the 1619 project versus the 1776 projects. Now, I want to point out that moderation does not have answers to all of these questions. These are electoral slogans most of the time. And I think that it's important to highlight the limits of moderation. It's not a virtue for all times. But I think that when we look at the attempts to simplify the political and the social landscape of today, I think that the world still needs some forms of moderation. And I think that the question then is, again, what kind of moderation? So I think it's important to share some good news as well. I do believe that there is some room for moderation. And I want to remind you that only 4 decades ago, moderates accounted for about 60% of the US Senate, 60%. Today, a little over 40% of the so-called independents tend today to be moderates in some form or another. A little over 37% of registered voters define themselves as moderates. And 70% of moderates would like to see, according to their views, a third major party. These numbers are taken from a study produced by a think tank in Washington called The Third Way. My hope comes from what's going on in civil society. There are a number of organizations there that I've been following over the last 5-6 years, like Braver Angels, Third Way, No Labels, the American Exchange Project, More in Common, Hidden Tribes, Heterodox Academy. All of these are examples of organizations that seek to build bridges to overcome polarization. And I think that it's fair to say that despite America's hyperpolarization, the middle may be larger than you think. There is an exhausted majority somewhere, you may belong to it, and that exhausted majority would want to restore some level of sanity in our world. So I think it's important to look at what moderation can offer to us today and examine each of these benefits. First and foremost, the greatest advantage is that moderation is not an ideology with fixed contours. It's much more than the proverbial golden mean between the extremes. It has affinities with different political traditions, liberalism, conservatism, and it can accommodate a wide range of political views and forms of government. It allows us, in other words, to think politically as opposed to thinking ideologically by the book. This means several things. I take the phrase thinking politically from Raymond Aron. It means, for example, it can mean choosing the lesser evil rather than seeking the perfect outcome, avoiding fixation on one particular principle, norm, in making political decisions, and believing also that to have political views is not a matter of once for all, that facts change and we must adjust our views as facts change. The contrast that I want to emphasize here is between thinking politically and thinking ideologically. Those who tend to think ideologically tend to believe that there is one single best way. Okay? And I think that this is precisely the idea that there is one single dimension that defines the political good. And there is a political panacea somewhere. And moderates do not believe that there are panaceas, and moderates believe in peaceful reforms and piecemeal reforms. And they believe that there are no absolute blueprints and final synthesis, that all we can achieve is a precarious but important equilibrium, a decent equilibrium that can prevent the occurrence of desperate situations. A decent society rather than a just society. That's what moderates believe. A decent society rather than a just society. It's a fragile balance between competing values and principles. It's a defense of pluralism of ideas and interests that are necessary to living in a free society. And I think that this flexible and skeptical mindset is precisely the opposite of fanaticism and dogmatism that are usually fixated on one single good value, principle, or agenda. That could be justice, that could be liberty, that could be equality. And I think that this mindset allows us to correct our mistakes, to understand that we are dealing with trade-offs between different values and principles, and it allows us to promote civility and compromise precisely when we need it more. It's the opposite of a crusading mentality. You don't seek to convert others to your views. And it helps lower the political temperature. I like this motto, may the other side be also heard, because it is indeed what moderates tend to believe, and it is a commitment to dialogue. It's the opposite of monologue, bubbles, and echo chambers. And last but not least, I would like to make here an apology of gradualism, piecemeal reforms. Gradualism has a bad image in today's world. We want quick change, radical change, but actually, because moderation accommodates a wide range of political ideas, views, and principles, I think it's important to remember that a gradual and incremental approach to public policy, complex issues are solved better through a gradual approach rather than a revolutionary approach. Peaceful reform allows for new ideas to be tested, evaluated, and changed over time. Errors can be corrected, and I think small changes tend to compound over time, like our income, I'm told by my financial advisors. So moderation in the same way, and gradualism can compound good results over time. I think that at the end of the day, it's difficult to be convinced by this unless you have a certain feel, a certain passion for moderation. And I don't want to convert anyone to the virtues of moderation. What I've tried to suggest is that this is a complex virtue. It is a tradition of thought, more complex than one would tend to think. And I think that it's important to challenge the common view of moderation as a weak virtue. I've tried to suggest that it's a muscular and a radical virtue that can be radical, that is different from the fuzzy center that some associate moderation with. And it is important to affirm this complex view of moderation precisely because in our political landscape we tend to simplify. And I would like to conclude my lecture tonight with some rules for radical moderates, which may be an oxymoron of sorts. 5 decades ago, Saul Alinsky, a famous left-wing community activist from Chicago, published a pragmatic primer for radicals, realistic radicals. It was a passionate invitation to radicals to promote social change in a turbulent age. Rules for Radicals became an instant bestseller in 1971. So I took the liberty of asking what would be the rules for radical moderates like. So I would like to share with you 5 such possible rules in conclusion of my lecture tonight. Rule number 1 is the simplest one. Refuse to define one single best way. avoid having fixed truth or dogmas when it comes to politics. Instead, try to examine facts and be prepared to amend and nuance your beliefs when facts change. Easier said than done, I have to confess. Rule number 2, avoid echo chambers and bubbles and do not be sectarian to the extent to which this is possible. Always try to think politically rather than ideologically. Keep the lines of dialogue open with your opponents, even when that may be uncomfortable or difficult. Now, rule number 3 is my favorite here. Do not be perfectionists. Start working with the world as is, not as it should be. Don't imagine theories of justice. Defend piecemeal reforms rather than utopian blueprints for change. Remember that the world is made by many shades of gray. I was told that there are 50 shades of gray. I don't know, but I do know that gray too can be beautiful. And this is something that I strongly believe in. Gray too can be beautiful. Rule number 4 says that we shouldn't become obsessed with purity, axis of evil, red lines, litmus tests. We should resist the temptation of dividing the universe between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, because at the end of the day, we may never know which side of the bargain we would end up on. And rule number 5 says the following: no particular belief should hurt us in political life. Admit that most political issues, yes, from public policy to international relations, have more than one side. As a result, we should resist the temptation to interpret events in light of any single value or principle. Again, freedom, justice, equality. New Green Deal or no deal, lower taxes, higher taxes, Second Amendment pro or against. Life is more complicated than that. And I think we should be prepared to make reasonable adjustments and strike compromises for the sake of the common good. So now, if you were to follow these 5 rules, there are actually 10 in my book, but in the interest of moderation, I reduced them to 5. I like to end my books on moderation with decalogues. Those are definitive statements on what you should do. So in this case, I applied a little bit of moderation. So if you are prepared to endorse these rules, I think you should be ready also to join me in launching this new movement that I've been engaged in, Make America Governable Again. So to return to the title and question of my lecture today, who is afraid of moderation? I'm prepared to say that those who are afraid of making America governable again are also afraid of moderation. And vice versa, those who are afraid of moderation are also afraid of making America governable again. And I think that this is the idea that I would say is the magnetic idea undergirding moderation, a muscular and a radical form of moderation, not a lukewarm compromise. And this is what we need today. Now, I would like to end with the words of Albert Camus. He's wiser than me and wiser than most of us in many ways. And he said this: our world does not need tepid souls. It needs burning hearts, men who know the proper place of moderation. So I would like to invite you to reflect on the words of Camus and think about the complexity and the timeliness of moderation in a world that has so little of it. Thank you very much.
As the curtain draws on the main lecture, on Professor Craiutu's lecture, we move on to questions and answers from our audience. And so or questions from our audience and answers from our speaker. If my usual injunction, if you have a question, please queue up at the microphones to ask it. If you have a speech, please don't give it. So we want to give everybody a chance to hear and our speaker a chance to answer. As we gather some questions, I'll take the moderator's prerogative and open with a question of my own. And Aurelian, you mentioned the juste milieu, the effort in France after 1789 and really after the Restoration in 1814 to find a balance that is neither revolution nor reaction. And this was the mission of a number of figures, Benjamin Constant and also François Guizot. But let me ask you a question. Why was it so difficult to achieve a juste milieu? In many ways, through the 19th century, revolution became not a moment, but part of the weather of French politics. And it seems to me that, that finding moderation is difficult. So what does that experience of crafting a juste milieu mean for our own day? What was so difficult and what can we learn?
So France is a country of extremes. The French Revolution has partly the answer to your question. During the French Revolution, there was a period, an opening period, 1789, 1791, when the French could have followed the British. So I don't need to tell you why the British Constitution, unwritten Constitution, was their model. But they didn't succeed. The liberals failed. And then followed the terror of 1793-94. So for a country to come back from the wounds of the terror and heal those wounds, it took decades. France has experienced with constitutions more so than any other West European country. I think there were 10 constitutions or so within a range of, 100-something years. And it shows that the French Revolution was starting over and over again. So the attempt to bring the revolution to an end, I think, was the main task of many generations. The liberals during this period that you mentioned sought to rely on the principle of 1789, like equality under the law and the ending of privileges, and oppose the principles of the terror of 1793-94. And I think that was a task that was not completed properly during that time. So finding a balance between the principle of 1793 and avoiding the excesses of the terror was precisely the attempt to find the juste milieu. And there were those who sought to revive the institutions of the ancien regime in France, and there were those who thought that the revolution didn't go far enough. So within this landscape, there were a few liberals. Tocqueville, by the way, belongs to the same generation in many ways, that understood that the future belongs to democracy, but democracy needs to be educated, purified of its revolutionary excesses. So this is the task of juste milieu, to accept what happened in 1789, but to prevent the excesses of 1793-94, which is the terror. For us today, I think the lesson is very important. And I don't know why I felt compelled to study the French liberalism is an oxymoron. I mean, you say French liberals and you say, who are they? And there aren't that many still today. But they understood something important. So democracy is just. Democracy is to be equated with justice, and there are some principles at the heart of democracy. Equality is one of them, and freedom, that are important. But democracy left to its own devices tends to go to extremes. And this is the lesson that the liberals in France understood better than others. So democracy needs to be educated, something that you are doing here at the school, for example. Democracy needs to be purified, needs to be moderated of its excesses. So I think that today this is a relevant lesson for us because in many ways we have an excessive belief in the virtues of democracy. I'm not here to let's say, praise the virtue of another form of government. I believe in the virtues of democracy, but democracy, to love democracy well, you need to love it with moderation, because democracy needs to be educated, need to be, let's say, purified of its excesses. And this is a task that is also challenging for us today.
A task for every generation
to
raise the next generation to be prudential and to be moderate. Let me turn to our first question.
Do you think that moderation and radicalism kind of wax and wane? Does one become more prominent and then radicalism declines, or do you think they kind of work in concert with another? If a society is more radical, is there potential for more moderation, which is something I don't see today? And can you provide an example of a period of moderation, or a political party or a politician who kind of exemplifies and epitomizes moderation?
Today?
Well, let's say in modern American history.
Modern American history, thank you. I do think there are cycles in history, and there are some moments of great radical revival and then kind of reactions to that. I do believe that the American political tradition does have such examples. And if you look at, I gave the example of General Washington, which is, I think, an important moment in the history of moderation in the United States. But I could also point out to two other figures in the American tradition. There are others who are more qualified to speak about them, but I just want to point them. Henry Clay is seen as the great compromiser, native of Kentucky, I think that it can be said, though his proposals were not perfect, but the compromises that he was able to strike gave the country 3 decades of economic prosperity that were enough to allow it to survive the horrors of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln would be the other character that I'd like to point out here. Lincoln was not an abolitionist by the standard definition of the term, but he sought to kind of, he took his cue from Henry Clay, by the way, but he sought to find a compromise, and when it was impossible for that compromise to continue, then he took the country into the Civil War. So I think that those are two examples that can be brought into the discussion. I think that there are some periods in history that are more moderate than others, and I would say that I grew up under communism in Romania, so I'm interested in opposition to communism, and I've learned. I looked at a few examples of opposition to communism, and you don't have to be moderate to oppose communism. So I'd like to give 2 examples here. One would be Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and the other one would be Andrei Sakharov in the former Soviet Union. Both were heroes of the anti-communist opposition. Solzhenitsyn defied the then existing hierarchies, communist hierarchies, through his publications, and he went into exile. Sakharov stayed in the Soviet Union, and he emphasized the importance of human rights. And he worked on the Helsinki Accords of 1975, and he carved out a space of freedom in the former Soviet Union. He died earlier than Solzhenitsyn. So one was, let's say, moderate, the other one was, let's say, seen as a more radical opponent, but at the end of the day, they both believed in moderation as a form of self-limiting virtue. And even Solzhenitsyn himself acknowledged the importance of moderation as a self-limiting virtue in opposing communism. So this only is meant to show the complexity of this virtue. And I think that if I were to speak about the relevance of moderation today, I would say precisely what I said earlier, that we need to emphasize the importance of making the country governable again. And it's not a statement about, winning over the others, crushing the enemy, permanent victory over the other, but making the country governable again. And I think that moderation can play a role in that.
Please, next question.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned briefly balance of powers and how that can keep things under control. Today, you may hear a lot about gridlock in Congress. Say, the opposing forces in Congress. Could that gridlock in itself be a driving force of moderation?
To the extent to which we are tired of hyper-polarization, sectarianism, and no results, I think that could lead to more. But I want to emphasize what I said in the lecture. I think that for me the hope comes from the local, from the grassroots level, what's going on in civil society. Organizations that I mentioned there, like Braver Angels, for example, give me hope that there is less room for gridlock than we think at the local level, at the grassroots level, that there are ways in which people understand that we have more in common with our political opponents than what separates us from them. So emphasizing too much gridlock at the level of politics that we see on our social media, on our cable news channels, I think that is at the end of the day, a little bit counterproductive. I like to see more about what's going on at the grassroots level. The American Exchange Project is something that I'm a great fan of. They sent young men and women from Kansas to live and spend some time with counterparts on the East Coast, and men and women from the East Coast to spend time with families in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and so forth. We get to you get to know each other better. You get to understand different ways of life, different aspirations, different backgrounds, and I think this is what we need more to bring that gridlock to a sustainable level.
It's interesting to me. Today we speak of the word enthusiasm, and you want enthusiasm. If you are a business and you're hiring an employee, you want an enthusiastic employee. Academics value enthusiastic students. But in the world of Montesquieu, and the world that Montesquieu is reacting to earlier in the 17th century, that enthusiasm had a bad name because it was passion, it was unbridled passion. So moderation is a break on enthusiasm.
And on zealotry.
And on zealotry.
Yeah. And on extremism, if you wish, today. I think that it's important to look at what defines the extremist mindset. And we can talk about that. I'm pretty sure everyone has seen this in action. And I think that it is the fixation on one principle. The idea that all we need is this rather than that. And as I try to suggest in my lecture, I think that the political good, and this is a lesson I learned from Montesquieu, is multi-dimensional rather than one-dimensional. And once you admit that, then I think that what is essential for us is to be fusionists, eclectic. So, for example, you can be, let's say, more radical in some economic issues and more conservative with regard to your religion, your cultural views, and so forth. You don't have to be, let's say, liberal or conservative in all spheres of life. Life is more complicated. Okay, you can be an eclectic figure, and I think this is what trimming is all about: how to trim your beliefs in such a way that you remain consistent. I think it was Scott Fitzgerald who said that the greatest thing that we can do is to have two opposing views at the same time and live with them and try to reconcile them. So this act of balancing different aspects, I think is essential. So I see this in myself, if I may give myself as an example here. I tend to be more liberal in some respects and more conservative in others, and that makes me kind of difficult to put on a political map. But I think that that's a healthy thing, and I'm not sure whether you agree with me on that.
Well, this is very different. This definition of moderation is very different from the good American expression 50-50. Well, it'll have a compromise, a 50-50 compromise. And that doesn't translate well into languages other than English. The concept, not just the words. So what you're talking about is being able to hold contradictory positions, not splitting the difference on principle.
Not splitting the difference, quoting like things that may seem contradictory. But I think one aspect that concerns me is that people want to find one single principle that dominates modern society. In my book, I refer to the idea that some believe that they are on a plane and there's a cockpit from where you can direct modern society. Well, I don't believe that's possible. I think that modern society is such complicated structure that there is no single principle. So let's say people on the far left define modern society as free market society. Everything is wrong because the forces of free market have taken over. Everything defines modern society through the lenses of free market. But I think that there are a whole lot of aspects of modern society that are not dominated by the principles of supply and demand. Let's take friendship, let's take beauty, let's take contemplation. All those spheres of life where you can find these things are not defined by sphere of demand. There are things that go beyond the sphere of supply and demand. This is the lesson, by the way, that I learned from the German economist and political philosopher Wilhelm Röpke, okay, who wrote a book on beyond supply and demand. There are things more important than the free market. But the free market is essential nonetheless, but you don't make it the culprit. This is what critics of neoliberalism today tend to affirm. And on the other hand, there are those who tend to believe that, I don't know, equality has taken over. And I think there are spheres of life that are not dominated by the principle of equality. We still apply the principle of competence, capacity. So we want to mitigate inequalities, and we should continue to applying that. So there's no single principle that can explain what happens in modern society, and that's why I think, I may be wrong, I think that eclecticism is what I think should define our attitudes. But there's no single way of being eclectic. You can be, let's say, conservative in economics and liberal in private life or politics. And this is exactly what happened with the conservative thinker Michael Oakeshott. If you read Oakeshott think, he was conservative in religion, conservative in politics, but very liberal in private life. And there's nothing wrong with that, in my view.
I might be wrong. That seems to be a quintessentially moderate phrase and conception.
I think Oakeshott himself was a moderate. And he uses the metaphor of trimming that was coined by Marquess of Halifax in his great book, The Politics of Skepticism and the Politics of Faith.
Please, questions?
Thank you, Professor Craiutu, for the lecture. I have actually a question about the last slide, where you have the quotation from Albert Camus, which says, like, yeah, there is to know the proper place of moderation. So by meaning that there is a proper place for moderation, there is also a place that is not proper for moderation. So I'd like you to explore, so which circumstances where moderation may not be the proper virtue for political action.
For the sake of fairness here, I should say that the origin of the quote is a little bit mysterious here, because in French, he never used the word moderation. Does anyone know what word he used, by the way? It's an interesting term. He used the word mesure, measure, which is different from moderation, but this is not my translation, but I like it nonetheless. So it serves my purpose. So measure. So it's like, it has to do with discernment, with judgment. So your question is right on the mark in the sense that you need to know when to be a moderate and when not to be a moderate. Seneca, for example, said this thing. Sometimes you need to go to the extremes in order to be moderate. But there's no algorithm. There's no algorithm that can tell you now you have to stop being a moderate and take a little bit, a grain of immoderation. But I think that there are certain situations where you could be. I mentioned the fight against communism, right, in the former Eastern Europe, and I think that the moderate could have been immoderate in its opposition to communism. Okay, you didn't have to, but you could have been. I think that you could be immoderate in defending key principles that sustain our free way of life. So there are some principles that we cannot compromise. We shouldn't compromise with Hitler in Munich in 1938. Okay, so you have to be immoderate in your sticking to the principle. You shouldn't compromise with those who deny the integrity of elections and things like this. So I think that's important. There are certain principles that are there and cannot be forgotten.
My question follows up from the one that was just asked. So Justice Antonin Scalia very famously derided moderation so my question, I guess, is about how moderation interacts with institutional obligations, separation of powers, for example. So Justice Antonin Scalia very famously said that he rejected the idea of moderation for judges. He said, what's a moderate interpretation of the Constitution? Halfway between what it really means and we want it to mean, by which he meant basically he feels an institutional obligation to enforce federalism, to enforce separation of powers, to enforce many of these structures that you described as moderation. Would you take Scalia's quote there to be sort of a challenge or incompatible with your understanding of moderation, or would you take it to be sort of harmonious with it, to say moderation is in fact not something that should be exercised in that particular sphere? That to be a moderate judge, for example, would mean to faithfully execute the office in that sense.
I think the image of moderation, thank you for the question, the image of moderation is that of a balance, right? So you have two sides, may the other herd side be heard. You need to judge and to make sure that both sides are heard. So I think that at the very heart of the act of judging lies discernment and a modicum of moderation. I don't want to tread on a territory that I'm not competent to comment, but I think that when it comes to understanding moderation, it's very important to understand the institutional and the constitutional aspects of moderation. And if you ignore those, I think you simplify what is otherwise a very complex picture. And anyone who wants to, for example, anyone wants to say we need a new constitution today, I think this is a radical view that I'm not prepared to uphold. And I think that it ignores precisely the complexities of the issues that you mentioned. On the other hand, so this is one aspect that I think is radical. On the other hand, a strictly originalist understanding of the Constitution, in my view, is also a radical position. So you need to find a balance between the two, between those who emphasize the need for a new Constitution. Sanford Levinson at the University of Texas is one of those most prominent proponents of this. Our Constitution is utterly undemocratic. We need something new. And those who stick to a strictly originalist understanding of the Constitution. So I think moderation is in between. I'm not sure if this satisfies your question and answers your question, but I think this is what I believe.
We have a moment for one more question.
I think the pressure's on now if I'm the last one. So I really like the way that you described moderation from different points of view. We can say sort of an ethical consideration, an institutional consideration of moderation, and I think ethos was the last
Ethos
one,
or
right?
style, yeah.
So faculty in the room, so interactions is I think the question. Part of what I'm considering is you've brought up Lincoln as a good example that looks to, we might be able to look at Lincoln's ethical moderation and the way that interacts with institutional moderation from the Constitution to be able to preserve that in rather immoderate times. But it seems that we were blessed with Lincoln. I think that your solution or answer is to point towards the moderation that's emerging in an ethos way in civil society. And you said something interesting that I'd like to hear more about. And I think that it's connected with this. So if I'm wrong, correct me, but also, you said that one ought to prefer a decent society rather than a just society. And I'm wondering if you could try to describe what the difference is between something that's decent and just, and how that works with this civil society movement for moderation in a ethos way.
Thank you for your question. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to elaborate on that. We all know the book by John Rawls, A Theory of Justice. It has defined the way in which modern liberal thought has been taught and presented in the last 50 years. Rawls sought to define a theory of justice by looking at two principles. And I think that he led to the emergence of a school of thought that built upon his two principles of justice. I think that's a great thing for political theory. On the other hand, Isaiah Berlin is the thinker that inspired me to think about just society as different from decent society. For Berlin, who was a liberal in the European sense of the word, which is right of the center here, a decent society is a society that maintains a balance between too much and too little. There is inequality in every society, so we need to have a society in which the extremes of inequalities are avoided. At the end of the day, so you have to have liberty, but not liberty at the expense of equality. You have to have equality, but not at the expense of liberty. At the end of the day, it's a very Aristotelian understanding of a decent society. It just happened that I taught Aristotle yesterday, and I was reading again 2 chapters from Politics, which is chapter 11 in book 3 and chapter 11 in book 4. And those 2 chapters are actually very qualified defenses of democracy. What did Aristotle stand for at the end of the day? Well, he stood off for a kind of a mixed government, which I define as a form of decent society, neither too much nor too little. And I think that gives us a sense of what a decent society is. It's not necessarily a just society. It will still have inequalities. It will still have differences. but it will be, let's say, animated by this ethos of avoiding excesses of all kinds. And I think that the concept of decent society was theorized by the Israeli political theorist Avishai Margalit in a book published in 1994. And he makes this contrast with Rawls's theory of justice. I think it's, first of all, it's a gradual objective to follow and to attain. It's less utopian than a just society. It doesn't mean that we give up on the principles of justice. It means that the concept of decent society, I think it's more attainable. At the end of the day, I think we should all acknowledge how privileged we are to live in our open societies. It's a privilege that was not given to previous generations. In history, certainly we are privileged from a larger standpoint of view, but we also need to understand that our free societies are fragile constructs, that they need constant nurturing, and that constant nurturing requires some form of moderation. I highly recommend a book that was translated into English last year. It's the last lecture given by Raymond Aron at Collège de France in 1978. It's called Liberty and Equality. And I think that the title, Liberty and Equality, gives you a flavor and an intimation of what a decent society is.
Well, thank you. Let me thank, first of all, our partners at Arizona Public Broadcasting for their efforts to record and to put all of this together, and our fine SCETL event staff who have planned and kept all the trains running on time to bring us here in this room, and also let me thank Aurelian Craiutu before we adjourn to a book signing and refreshments outside. Thank you again.
Thanks for your questions.